We are governed by people whose ideology is essentially alien to the spectrum of ideologies that everyone else shares. I mean, immigration is the single biggest political issue in Australia today. Oh, well, people are going on holidays and they're buying cars and they're buying PlayStations or whatever, and you think the economy's doing really well. But then look at those people's savings accounts. They've stopped saving because the idea of owning a home is ludicrous to them. And so I think we are going to see, not from the major parties, but from the minor parties, some really interesting people nominate and some really interesting people run. And so if you can find one of them, I mean, just go out and support them. I think if Albo wins, we're going to see some variation of a carbon tax. We're going to need third-party boots on the ground to make sure that the militants don't start another war. And it sounds to me from Dutton's rhetoric, he intends that to be us.
John Macgowan, welcome to the studio, mate.
G'day, how you going?
I think you agree with me, mate, that Australia is facing particularly perilous circumstances at the moment, and that coincides at a time when the standard of politics in this country could not be lower. Is that the way you see it?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I don't think it's ever been as bad as it is now. I've been referring to this upcoming election as the last election. I think in the same way that final election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney in the US was the last of a certain style and culture of politics, this one will be the last election of the same style and culture of the elections of the past.
Just to sort of elaborate on that point, I don't think Australia can survive another 3 years of Labor.
I don't know. Well, they definitely can't. I don't know if another 3 years of Liberals is going to be any better than the previous 3 years of Scott Morrison. That's the challenge for right-wingers across our country who are staring at this election, begrudgingly voting for Peter Dutton. On the menu, you have a Liberal Party with really no foundationally conservative policies yet. We've got a nuclear policy that it's very difficult to see how it's going to work or how much it's going to end up costing, as much as people like me may love nuclear. 7 experimental reactors dotted across the country. Who knows if that's going to work or not? They've got no immigration policy, which is the big issue for every single person on the right in the country. They've got, as they always have, a small policy around illegal migrants and criminal people who should lose their citizenship because they're criminals, which was immediately the subject of internal division as soon as it was announced. So you got to wonder if that'll be able to get up. And then the rest of what they're doing is just this kind of grab bag of little stuff in the 21 key seats that they think they need to win.
Well, let's talk about those 21 key seats in a minute. But I'd say in defence of the Liberal Party or the coalition at this point is they're keeping their powder dry, which is the standard strategy in elections. Yeah. The coalition can't afford to release too much detail about their policies because Labor could just then steal it. I mean, that's a symptom of the fact that we have a uni-party anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
For generations, it wasn't possible for Labor to steal coalition policies because they were different parties.
Yeah.
But do you think that there is certainly a lot of ammunition for the coalition to work with? They are critical of the current government. Do you think it's a good strategy? You're a political insider. Do you think it's a good strategy for the coalition to keep its powder dry until the election's called? Because people like you and I are just wallowing in despair.
Well, I mean, if you're inside Dutton's campaign, you know something that for the rest of us who are kind of passionate observers of politics kind of often forget, is that the general public really only pays attention for the last 2 weeks.
Right.
So for most people, all these policies are going to pass them by. If you look at both major parties kind of mugging for the multicultural vote right now, which is getting both their bases offside, whether it's the blue-collar base of the Australian Labor Party or the right-wingers in the outer suburbs of the Liberal Party. There's a good chance that what they're doing there is getting it all out of the way now. So they spend all this time and effort, plastering their social media pages with them, bindies and, in fancy dress for all these different multicultural communities. But then they'll stop that in the last 4 weeks of the campaign because they'll think the work's been done. So there might be an element of that. They're kind of in a bind, though, thanks to, and this is how things tend to work in kind of big, important election campaigns, is something completely beyond their control happened, which was Cyclone Albert, formerly known as Cyclone Anthony, actually, until they changed it. And as a result, I mean, we should be in the election campaign right now. It was likely he was going to call it for the 12th of April, or possibly, I mean, I'd even heard as early as March 29. Right. So we should probably be in the election right now, but we're not. And then on top of that, they now have to have a budget, which I reckon I'd say with some confidence, next week's budget will be the worst in Australia's history. Like, it is going to look terrible. And the reason for that is if you were in Canberra lobbying, like a lot of my colleagues are, talking to, senior ministers, 2 months ago, there was no budget. As far as they were concerned, they were going to go straight into an election in either late March, mid-April, or at the very outside, the end of April. So there was never any intention to have a budget.
So it's a hastily cobbled
together. Now thanks to a cyclone, and so you just ask,
I blame climate change.
Yeah. So when you're looking at like what will inevitably be a massive deficit, and the consequences of that, and on top of that, there's a process that governments go through to create budgets. People put the begging bowl out. There's lobbyists circling around. There's usually some long-term goal for the budget. It's very rare for you to have one of these budgets right before an election campaign where the long-term goal is just getting elected. Like, there's not going to be much for the future in there. I mean, it's a standard practice in politics that you don't leave anything on the table for your enemy. They've already got massive issues on revenue. The black market in tobacco created by them through the huge excise has just driven a multi-billion-dollar hole through their revenue. So they're going to have less money.
What percentage of tobacco is going through the black market now?
Well, if you look at the reduction in receipts to the Commonwealth government in excise versus how many people have actually stopped smoking, I mean, it's as much as 50%. So,
and this is funding criminal.
Yeah, exactly. But then on top of that, I mean, for decades, tobacco excise was just a reliable way to make money. This is why they're always kind of talking out the other side of their face on something like health reforms around tobacco usage, because the federal government can't live without that money. But now they pushed it too far. They made a pack of cigarettes so expensive that you've incentivised every smoker in the country to go to the black market, and so now they're not getting any money out of it. And I mean, we not all that money goes to organised crime, because I mean, a pack of black market cigarettes is $15, not $40. But a significant amount of it's flowing into organised crime. If you're like me, if you live out in the suburbs, I mean, I have 4 tobacconists on each point of the intersection in my local town in Earlwood, and they've just appeared over the last 6 months. They weren't always there.
Are they shady organisations?
Well, I buy my vapes there, so I know that they are. I know at least one is. So it's just kind of a farce that they indulged in that.
But this is an example of how politics is failing us. I mean, politicians create these problems, and then they either profess to have fake solutions for them, or they just pretend that the problems don't exist at all. Blind Freddy can see that there's a problem going on. I mean, housing is another good example, caused by migration, and infrastructure projects sucking up all the tradies who would otherwise be building houses. How did we get to this point, John, where the standard of politics in this country is so stupidly low?
Well, if you unpack it, so the 2 key issues that mean they can't solve the problems. There's always problems. Like, a new problem is going to come up in politics every day. There's the phenomenon that when I first started working in politics was in the early 2000s, and very old guys I worked with, guys who had worked as far back as Fraser and Menzies, would frequently point out that the only things we have left to do now are the very hard things, that our predecessors have done all the easy things. for 30 years. I mean, creating Medicare. I mean, it was hard to do, but it was like an easy and obvious reform. Superannuation, all these kind of transformative things.
Floating the dollar.
Yeah, every transformative policy of the Australian government from the late 1960s to the mid-90s is pretty much self-evident, leading up to the GST.
Yeah.
And the GST is probably the first, it's the last example of one of the more obvious economic reforms being done, but kind of the first example of, well, now we've got to do the really hard things. We've got to convince the Australian public to pay 10% more for literally every single thing they consume. And John Howard did that. I mean, he did that, and then he won the next election while also taking the guns off all the national voters. And he scraped across the line with it. I mean, I've heard this story many times, and I think it's apocryphal, but I like to believe it, that when John Howard was brought the polling on the GST, it was like abysmal. I mean, when they went out and polled people and said, do you want to pay 10% more for every good and service for a commensurate reduction in income tax? Like, no one wanted it. Everyone just said no. And instead of saying, well, we've got to throw that out, Howard said to his advisors, how do we make that number go up? I've been in rooms with these guys since where you put bad polling in front of them for things that you should do, and they'll just throw it out. They'll just say, no, we're not doing it anymore. And so that culture of leader who sees a challenge and says, well, how do we convince people? Certainly at a federal level, I mean, John Howard is the last one of those. Everything else that's been done since, they're all these self-evident things that you don't really even need to campaign on. I mean, Bill Shorten and Kevin Rudd, and I think it was Julie Gillard at the time, they didn't really need to campaign on the NDIS. They went out to, I mean, no one even questioned the NDIS, which we really should have at the time.
Well, I see it as a prank, actually,
Yeah,
because Gillard introduced it knowing she was going to first lose the leadership and then Labor was going to lose the next election. This is 2013, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it came in early 2013. It was always going to be a disaster for revenue, sucking out revenue out of the government. And she just kicked it down to the incoming coalition government. And it's been a problem ever since. So when you say, no one, they didn't have to question anything.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have to sort of bring the electorate along with you if you're spending money.
Yeah, on them, on things they like.
Exactly,
There wasn't much of a campaign done to give everyone $1,500 a fortnight during COVID. You didn't really have to convince people that was a good idea.
All the big structural reforms were done up until the mid-90s. What are the big structural reforms that we need to do now?
But we need an entire rethink of how the federal government makes money, how we prioritise growth. And immigration is immigration is the single biggest political issue in Australia today. It is also the issue that both the Labor and Liberal parties have run a million miles an hour from, because there are 21 seats that they need to flip to form government, and they are disproportionately full of ethnic minorities who have come out recently and who don't want a reduction in immigration. Right? They don't want immigration reform. So
welcome to democracy.
So you have, and so it's not really democratic, because it's really just an exploitation of the system. We haven't always campaigned like this. What we call key seat campaigning really only emerges in 1996 by the Liberals when they beat Keating with Howard. I mean, Keating was a fairly unstoppable force in Australian politics until the recession took the wind out of his sails. But even then, it was still going to take something pretty big.
He certainly had the media on.
Yeah, well, absolutely. He still has it now in more than one country. A certain other country's media really likes Paul Keating for some reason, and Bob Carr.
Well,
so
go figure.
If you go back to the mid-90s, like getting Keating out with all this grassroots support from, Australia's working class rusted on Labor voters through to, academics in the leafy suburbs, through to what we, by the late 1990s, were calling the doctors' wives of the North Shore. He had all this support from them. And so the Liberals realised, and a lot of that crosses over into Liberal heartland. So the traditional way of campaigning, which was at the squeakiest wheels, the guys on the biggest, the safest seats who had the longest tenure, kind of directed the strategy, was completely inverted. And so you had strategists then saying, well, no, we don't care if we lose 10% of our margin in this seat, because we're still going to win it. That doesn't matter. It's pointless to spend money there. Let's spend money in the seats that are held on ultra-tight margins. And that really begins in the mid-90s. And that creates the environment. It does two things. And to go back to your question about why are things so bad, I mean, so it focuses the attention of the federal government on just a handful of policies that matter to just a handful of people in a handful of seats, and the rest of us can be damned, right? So, I mean, there's heaps of examples of it in right-wing politics. There's even significant examples of it in left-wing politics. I mean, up until very recently, one of the cause célèbres of the kind of alternative left, your Socialist Alliance guys and stuff, is increasing the rate of job seeker, right? Lifting it up from where it is now, where it's well below the poverty line. You would think, with a left-wing Labor Prime Minister and a cabinet of about 30-40% made up of the left, that would be something that he would put straight in his agenda when he got in. But it's the opposite. He has no intention of doing it. And in fact, they've talked it down whenever it's come up. They're refusing to do it. They've not done anything about it.
Albanese.
Albanese, yeah.
They don't want to increase the job seeker allowance.
And the reason for that is all these people on job seeker, they're spread out all over the country. They're not a voting cohort in any seat that matters. So it's not like, the areas surrounding Mount Druitt are a significant problem for anyone, and you've got to give them some extra cash to get them to vote for you. They just don't care about you.
Yeah.
Now, it's this massive issue. I mean, people are living in cars. They're lining up at food banks. Going on job seeker in Australia is a death sentence. You're better off earning cash in hand, probably.
Yeah.
There's no one wants to stop it because there's no electoral force behind it.
So why, given that there's 21 key seats, and like I said earlier, we'll come back to those seats in a minute, but let me just throw something at you like Ukraine. Why are they both backing Ukraine to the hilt? How does that affect those 21 seats?
Well, I think you've got to, especially with the Liberal Party, things come from two directions, right? There's the desire to win in your key marginals. There's also the lobby groups that help bankroll you. Mm-hmm. Ukraine is a really interesting one because there's a moneyed pro-Ukraine lobby out there. I mean, I know the pro-Ukrainian lobbyists. They're really good guys. I've worked with them.
Are they Ukrainian?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the best guys in Australia on Ukraine is a guy called Peter Schmigel, who I think heads some kind of like Ukrainian-Australian association and, does a lot of work with their ambassador and stuff. I mean, yeah, they're Ukrainian, and they've been campaigning on a lot of this stuff and since all the way back in 2014. It's a strange one that Dutton would get kind of obsessed with. I feel like there's an element that he's trying to balance a future relationship with Trump and a future relationship with Starmer. Like, he really doesn't want to walk away from, the special relationship we have with the UK, which if anyone's been to the UK in the last 4 years, like I was a monarchist for 2 decades. I'm now a staunch Republican. You
know what? I don't think the Republican movement in Australia knows what is about to hit it.
Yeah,
because people like you and I are now
because we're sitting there going, wow, like I don't want to be associated with those guys anymore.
Yeah, and exactly. And republicanism would be an opportunity for us to embed some. I mean, to them, it's just changing who's the governor general.
Yeah. To us, it's changing the system of government, right?
Exactly.
And there's incredible things that can be done there, and. It also sends this really clear message. I saw a fantastic graph the other day, and it was like countries with percentage of countries with percentage of British-born ancestors. And on the map, it's like Canada is like 48%. Britain itself is like 76%. And Australia is 70%. And then you look at the long-term trends on that, even with all our immigration problems, there's actually going to be a point where there will be more people of British or English ancestry in Australia than there will be in Britain. on their current rate of immigration and the lack of fertility amongst British white people. And our current rate, where our fertility rate is slightly higher, and although our immigration is unsustainable, it's not at their rate. There's going to be this crossover point where Australia is more British than England. And at that point, you look at it and say, well, why are we still clinging on to this? It is now essentially a failed state. Yeah. I mean, and the Americans proved that, yes, there's a political solution to some of these intractable problems. But they also have the benefit of 50 governors in 50 states running 50 different political agendas. So when someone like Donald Trump comes in to clean it up, he's not cleaning up 50 whole states. You can triage it and say, well, this is where the problems are. Yeah. But the UK doesn't have that. No. The UK is just... And it's the same here. I mean, as things get worse here... I mean, as much as I get mad at the guys in New South Wales Labor, I mean, Chris Minns is the best premier in the country. Right. You know, the stupid... He says stupid stuff sometimes, but... At the end of the day, this state is being ran better than the others. So,
but the problem with Australia is this encroaching federalism.
Yeah. So, but in the UK, that's all you have.
That's all you have.
So,
indeed. Yes.
And
so we need to probably call a halt to the increasing power of Canberra.
It's a warning sign. It should be a warning sign to everyone that without the foil of state government, you can land yourself in a lot of hot water very quickly. There's no one to tell you no. There's no challenge to your constitutional authority. If I was a premier in New South Wales, I would say, and he's got another couple of years to go. I mean, and all the premiers should be doing this is just picking on Commonwealth overreach and challenging it. You know, there's great Solicitor Generals and great, counsel for all the states. You could start taking things to the High Court and really challenging them. And saying, well, is this a case? Is this something the Commonwealth should even have influence over?
But the endemic problem there, John, is that Chris Minns is more loyal to the Labor Party than he is to New South Wales. He's never going to challenge Canberra as long as there's a Labor Party in government. And if it was the coalition, it would be too much trouble to... Yeah.
I mean, it's been a long time since we've had that kind of energy from the coalition in any of the states. I mean... Gladys Berejiklian Dom Perrottet was kind of stuck with the trailing edge of COVID and he had to recover from it. He didn't really have an opportunity to do much. As much as he was the most conservative Liberal leader they've ever had, he just kind of got stuck with a bad deal and there was no real opportunity.
He was stuck with Matt Keane.
Yeah. So he can't really stretch his wings and fly. Gladys Berejiklian's passion is infrastructure development and she did an amazing job of that, but that's really all she did. And... Her priority was just getting more infrastructure. So where she ran into problems with the feds, her strategy was quite clever, is she just diverts away and does something else transformative that she can do quicker. The last guy to really kind of stand up and challenge his own Liberal federal government would have been Mike Baird. Mike Baird took them to task on a lot of things, won some, lost some. And Mike was one of the last people too who really went to an election campaign with a hard policy.
Let's talk about what the options are for the punters because, you're talking about what the coalition has offered in the past. You've got a pretty good, accurate finger on the pulse of what's happening in the electorate. What are the options for people like you and I who love Australia, have want government out of our lives, and want it to stop spending and want it to reduce immigration? What are our political options at the moment?
Well, assuming the uni party stays to form, the minor parties that have emerged, you've got the legacy of One Nation. One Nation's still there. One Nation's numbers don't go really up or down. One Nation's voters vote for Pauline Hanson. Yep. They have woeful engagement with their rank and file because why would you join a party that's run by one person that just does whatever she wants? Yep. So One Nation you can't put off to one side. It will get 3 to 4% of the vote, as it always has done. The thing spun out of UAP, the Trumpets of Patriots, it really just seems like another lark by Clive Palmer that has no chance of actually getting significant results. His policies incomprehensible. I saw one yesterday where he was talking about letting people dip into their superannuation, like taking out more money. Like there's just not. This stuff is from the back of a notepad. He is last time he spent, I think it was 180 million, and got no seats. So I just don't see he's going to perform well. Then you get into the actual. I think the three most viable right movements today are the Libertarian Party, which is not perfect. Like state by state, I think some libertarians are better than others. You've got Jared Rennick's thing, which again is a one-man band designed to get Rennick back into the Senate. But I think Rennick, as difficult as he can be to listen to sometimes, I think intellectually is probably the best thing that the Commonwealth, the federal parliament has on the right. And then there's a kind of sleeper is the Sustainability Party, which has been in field for 15 years, I think. Originally backed by Dick Smith, with a focus on, population sustainability. Never been like super political, but we've seen over the last few years like a steady incline in their vote. And I think they've formed this alliance with Libertarians and Rennick. And I think they could be a real force in some places where Rennick and the Libertarians can't run. And then, of course, you've got the Greens and everyone else. We're not going to vote for them. The interesting thing is, like, for the first time, there aren't like rebels inside the major parties that it feels like people can vote for, which they used to have in the Senate. Now, Antic isn't up this time. It used to be that if you were like us and that you were a bit further to the right and wanted more radical action, there was always someone in both major parties. There was always someone loitering around the Senate who could be a kind of lightning vein for that, but not anymore.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
The discipline within the major parties has pretty much snuffed out free speech altogether.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, what there's been is just a refining of the major political parties' human capital from these people who ran in the 80s and 90s who were rogues and business people and, kind of flamboyant lawyers who used to run, people with real personality and things to say. As people go through, as there's scandals and issues, they start winnowing them out. Yeah. And you end up with this template of a candidate.
A template, I like.
Who just, that they don't vary from. They want preferably a woman with former staffer, a little bit of experience in the private sector as a consultant, and young enough that there hasn't been enough time for them to do anything wrong. And if they have a husband who can help fund the campaign, all the better. So that's kind of like the perfect candidate.
Here's an interesting disparity between most politicians and the electorate. I sense that there's a reasonable level of approval and even affection towards Donald Trump among ordinary Australians. Yeah. But almost universally, our politicians think he's dodgy, untrustworthy, criminal. How does that disparity work?
Well, people tell you it's something to do with like the bubble of Canberra, and they're all hanging around and socialising with these kind of elite journalists who have these elite American liberal opinions. That's a factor. I think it's something deeper than that. I make this point quite a bit. When I was young, I didn't always have like a cool job in politics. I spent a lot of time knocking on doors with a clipboard, and early on our like data sheets, is you would ask people questions organically. Like we used to ask people, what political ideology do you identify with? And you would talk to folks, and you get a lot of people saying they're progressive. You get as many people saying that they're just socialists. You get a lot of people saying they're conservative.
Is this around Sydney?
This is all over the country where I worked, right? Yeah. You even get a small percentage of people who openly say they're nationalists and a little percentage of people who say they're libertarians. But in my entire career, I never knocked on a door and spoke to a person who said they were a classical liberal or a social democrat. And if you really think about it, there, just in your everyday life, when people whose ideologies you're familiar with, how many classical liberals and social democrats have you ever met? We are governed by people whose ideology is essentially alien to the spectrum of ideologies that everyone else shares. No one else sees the world that way. Normal people see the world through either a progressive lens or a conservative lens, or maybe a libertarian lens, or maybe a socialist lens, or maybe even a nationalist lens. No one in the real world even understands what social democracy is, or, I mean, maybe has a little bit of an understanding of classical liberalism, but could probably point out its myriad failures in economics in the last 20 years.
Well, classical liberalism has become a phenomenon in the past 10 years. That's interesting. I'd never thought about that before.
These people are, they're essentially aliens. They're not reflecting the kind of lived political ideologies of the people who vote for them. And that's a huge, huge problem. You can't run countries like that. I mean, there's a few exceptions. I mean, I guess, the Singaporeans kind of do it with their system, if you want to call that democracy. But you can't really do that.
But why are politicians increasingly authoritarian as well?
Well, they can get away with it in Australia, and they know now they can get away with it. I think there was always a doubt about it, a doubt in their mind. And I think with the gun laws in 96, that there was a feeling that, well, maybe that's the exception to the rule, like we got on that at the right time. But then over the next decades, a pattern emerges back at the height of what we call the legacy media, where, X happens, media calls for Y, which is usually some kind of crackdown, politicians oblige, vote goes up.
Yeah.
And we saw that pattern over and over again. In New South Wales, it starts with Bob Carr. I mean, Bob Carr was the master of that. He'd wake up in the morning, there's a story about knife crime. Bob's got a knife crime policy in the afternoon. It's probably stupid, but everyone loves it. And it kind of reached its zenith with Barry O'Farrell and the lockout laws. You've got the one punch attack. The newspaper says this is awful, we need to do something about it. And then, you close down Sydney's nighttime economy.
Which everyone hated.
Yeah, yes.
But against all that, while that's happening, digital media, unrestrained and unedited and uncontrolled, is emerging. And suddenly the population is aware of the fact that there's been this collusion between the media and politics.
Yeah.
Like, as you say, there's a crisis and the politician says, here's my solution. The media runs it, and then they move on to the next story the next day.
And it's
entirely selective.
Yeah.
But now we are starting to realise, ordinary people are starting to realise, just how selective that cycle was. It excluded everything else, like immigration or, the spending in the government or
well, if there's anything they didn't want to talk about, if there was any kind of common interest between the mainstream media and the politicians, they simply didn't talk about it. And for years, I mean, immigration was a big one. And I mean, look, if you talk to newspaper editors or the C-suites of News Corp and Fairfax, they don't really care about immigration. They care about their advertisers. Yeah. They care about the people who are buying the full-page ads, the Business Council of Australia. I mean, at this point, advertising revenue decline is so deep that it is only the biggest companies of the ASX that are keeping the newspapers afloat. So occasionally...
And the government itself.
Yeah, well, the government's the biggest advertiser in the papers, right? So occasionally you have these common interests and they kind of suppress discussion on an issue like immigration. But by and large, I think that's fading now. We're seeing the readerships of these outlets just decline and decline. They're desperate to make up any narrative about it they can by saying, oh, we're moving online, look at how good our online numbers are. But the audiences...
yeah, don't kid me.
The audiences are plummeting.
They've been fudging numbers for decades.
Yeah. I mean, how many copies of the Daily Telegraph are dropped off at, sheltered workshops every day? I don't think that the audience is there for them anymore. They've failed to do what the American liberal media did, which was just completely change their business model. I mean, if you read the New York Times, it's trash for anyone right of centre, but they just realised, well, the only way we can stay afloat is we have to pitch specifically to these people that we know are going to pay the exorbitant subscription fee. Yeah. And I mean, if you go onto the New York Times, if you're a subscriber and you go onto the New York Times website, it just has one ad. So you click on it, New York Times, Democracy Dies in Darkness, whatever, one banner ad, usually for luxury goods or Aspen ski holidays or a timeshare down in the Hamptons. Yeah. And then the rest of it, you don't see another ad. Now, you go onto the Sydney Morning Herald, which has an exorbitant subscription fee for what it is, and you click on it and it's just ringed with ads. It looks like you're driving through the digital equivalent of Vegas. And you ask yourself the question, well, how well must they be doing? When the New York Times have gone, well, this is our audience. And you know, ideologically, they're the same audiences. And the Sydney Morning Herald tries to plaster it with ads. Like, they're not doing great, I think.
So how much of a problem is the emergence of this unrestrained digital media to the political process?
I don't think it's well, I mean, I probably cause danger myself to the political process by doing it. You get fake news, you get stuff that's exaggerated and whatever. I mean, there's a great democratisation to it, particularly on X, where you've got community notes and, you know, so you can correct things that, you know, people are deliberately doing wrong. It opens the door for all kinds of foreign interference stuff. But I mean, you can't really criticise it for that in Australia when we have foreign interference in the chamber of Parliament. We have MPs who are, for all intents and purposes, assets of foreign governments. So I don't think that's as big an issue as people make out. The issue for them is, like I said about their alien ideologies, on the far left and far right, people have kind of drifted so far away from the uniparty, they're never coming back. You'll never be able to get those people back. And I'd say it's between 5 and 10% of the population on either side now. And if you look at the primary vote, which is now below 67% for the two parties combined, that's the lowest it's ever been in Australian history.
That's frightening, because that also reflects social fragmentation.
Which is really bad. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. And, you know, not knowing who the actual enemies are is a huge problem. I mean, I've been enormously critical in the last couple of weeks online about Advance and their campaigning. And they're a right-wing campaign group from Queensland. They've done some fun stuff in the past, probably helped us, the Liberals win Wentworth at one point. But their focus now is on this thing about the Greens. And they're saying, put the Greens last, which is a bizarre thing for a conservative campaign organisation to do, because they're not really our competition. There's all these...
Well, they are in the Senate, though.
In the Senate,
because, I mean, if you look at it strategically, it's a really thin line, really thin line between losing control of the Senate and taking control of the Senate through the crossbench.
Which this campaign will probably sort itself out with the other minor parties that are in play. But the issue there is that what the establishment parties try to do is force this wedge between the left and the right, so that you never stop and go, actually, these people are not our enemies. They're our intellectual opposition. Right. But they're not our enemies. We all want the same things. The best case scenario is a country where you have, you know, a Greens opposition leader and a prime minister from a right-wing party that doesn't exist yet. Right? That's the future that can save the country. It's just not, it's not going to be, one party and the old parties on the other side of the chamber. The Greens vote has to actually go up for us to save the country. I don't think people have ever really thought about that. Can you elaborate on that? If a new right-wing party emerges, right, out of the ashes of One Nation, out of the current kind of radical right we're seeing rise post-COVID, if it takes right-wing conservatives from the Liberals, if it takes a couple of blue-collar conservatives from Labor and becomes a force that you could potentially win an election with, the question is not, what do they do after the election? It's who's going to be the opposition, right? So do you then end up with an opposition that's made up of Teals, Liberals, the Labor left, or do you end up with an actual left-wing opposition? A right-wing government, a left-wing opposition, a left-wing government, a right-wing opposition that keeps each other honest, that puts up policies that the other side can really butt heads on.
But do you think you can engage the Greens in an honest sort of debate about a common goal? Because as far as I'm concerned, the Greens pretty much hate Australia.
Well, they do for now. But, it's like with, the phenomenon, you see the phenomenon of the National Socialist Network, right? Yeah. People adopt transgressive radicalism when they feel there's no hope of a political solution. And the worse things get, the small percentage of people who are doing that anyway gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the transgressions get bigger and bigger and bigger, whether it's, you know, waving a swastika or waving the hammer and sickle, because you feel like there's no political solution to the problem. My people with my values are never going to be sitting in that chamber anyway. When you dangle the possibility of engagement with the political system in front of those people, they de-radicalise extraordinarily quickly, and that's what you see if you look in the two countries where this has happened most recently. Are in France in the early 2000s with the National Front National and the Alternative for Deutschland. Like, both these parties have origins that are not even really as parties. These far-right antagonistic organisations that don't care to engage in politics. And then as that chance of engagement increases, their level of radicalism decreases to the point where now you look at the candidates for Alternative for Deutschland. These are like button-down kind of stockbrokers and, you know, normal people, right?
Yeah.
Not people with jackboots and short haircuts.
So what's the likelihood of that happening in Australia?
Well, tomorrow, 0. The next day, 0. But I mean, these things take decades to happen. Absolutely decades. I mean, it's taken decades for a single non-Tory MP, Nigel Farage, to get into the parliament. I mean, these guys have been running UKIP was running for 10 years, went nowhere. I mean, the British National Party ran for years. I think they had a mayor, was as well as it got. And I think they may have had one early member of the European Parliament. But traditionally, they just went nowhere. It's taken them decades just to get one guy, right? Yeah. It took, if people look at Trump and they think, well, this just came out of nowhere. Like, Trump just arrives fully formed in late 2015 and takes the world by storm. That's nonsense. The movement that created Trump began when Trump was still making The Apprentice and had no intention of running. It goes all the way back to the early 2000s, the establishment of Breitbart, the election of Barack Obama, and the kind of mainstream right revolt where you had the Tea Party. Yeah. It starts with, you know, Stephen Miller, who's now in Trump's administration, as at Duke University in 2009, with Richard Spencer, who would go on to create the alt-right. And those two guys start this new right culture of antagonism, of protest, of, you know, crashing the left's little woke soirees and holding up banners and things. That all starts in 2009, you know, years before Trump's even on the scene.
So do you see us at a similar phase along that?
Well, if 2009 was their beginning of it, where are we in relation to that? We're not even at 2009 yet.
Oh, really? That's
different. I think we've got decades.
You just said we.
I have a better understanding of how well organised Australia's alternative right is.
Excuse me, we live on a major thoroughfare near a police station here. So
they're probably coming for me. We'll back onto that Trump thing. So where we are in relation to that, like, I have a better inside picture of what the Australia's kind of dissident right is doing the most. We're not even that level of organisation yet. You know, we don't have an alternative media ecosystem. We're getting one slowly, but it's not there yet. We don't have people that, if, you know, we could get organised into a party, you could potentially run. We don't have any of that. We're nowhere near that point. We do have, I think, something that the Americans didn't have, and it's ironic, is actually thanks to COVID, we do have, like, a place where everyone is kind of getting their content, getting a lot of this kind of political campaign material, which is X, which is the streaming services, which is on YouTube. You know, Australia had this massive growth in alternative media personalities that happened during COVID. They're not all amazing, but they're there, and they're, you know, they're well beyond, like, you know, the ideological tone of something like Sky News. They're, you know, promoting a lot of these ideas and promoting a lot of the questioning of what we now call the uniparty. So we've got that at least, but the rest of it is years off.
So what should people do?
I think the main thing to do this time around is to focus in on their local right-wing minor parties, join them if you can. I mean, if you're a member of the Liberal Party, you can join the Libertarians for free. They actually will let you transfer your membership and waive the costs. That's a really... and I've heard from people inside the Liberal Party that's hurt them a lot. But I mean, who wants to be in the Liberal Party? It just doesn't... Who wants to sit around and eat scones and talk about John Howard all day? So you've got... So forget about that. I mean, join some of these small groups. Learn about the candidates and find candidates you like and support them. Because I think, there's an emerging culture that the days of instant cancellation are over. It used to be if you're a bit of a rogue in politics, if you had a bit of a checkered history, the media would drag you over hot coals, you'd be forced to resign by your own people very quickly. I think that's changed a lot. And so I think we are going to see, not from the major parties, but from the minor parties, some really interesting people nominate and some really interesting people run. And so if you can find one of them, I mean, just go out and support them. I mean, manpower... I always describe political campaign expenditure as a square root of manpower, money and time, right? And if you want to go back to something like the UAP's abysmal failure in the last 2 elections, they spent twice as much money as anyone else, but they had a fraction of the manpower and they only started so late that they didn't have any time.
Right.
Now, these new minor parties and people like Rennick's operation and stuff, I mean, they haven't got much time. They aren't going to have much money. So the only thing you can contribute to them to help them is manpower. Whether it's showing up on a booth, handing out a flyer, door knocking, it's really the only thing I think people can do.
Do you fear about the fragmentation of Australia, though? I mean, you mentioned a minute ago that, we need to save the country, and I agree with you about that. But the country socially, as a society, is heading in a pretty bad direction. Yeah.
Well, in terms of social fragmentation versus political fragmentation, I mean, we have the advantage of compulsory preferencing. So the party fragmentation doesn't hurt that much.
Right.
In terms of the social fragmentation, I mean, we got to look at who drives some of this stuff, where some of this stuff is coming from, how much of it is even, an outgrowth of our own domestic policies, and how much of it is coming from foreign countries. Right? Is that not the draw? I think that is a lot of the reason we see this wedge being put through communities is because it benefits people who hate our country.
Yeah. Why is there this consensus that we need high immigration? I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that, our leaders are getting their orders from overseas. What's your opinion?
I think it's really simple. I mean, I've been in some of these governments. I mean, you just look at the budget balance sheet and you look at the consequences of what happens if we don't have net positive growth. I mean, it's not just the threat of a recession or eventually a depression. If we were to go into an effective recession, the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to downgrade our credit ratings and the debt repayments are going to go up. So you're just going to see this hole driven through the budget. So when I said it's a total revolution in terms of how you run a government is what has to happen, because you're going to have to come in and say, step one, I mean, John Ruddock, who I think you had on your show, said, 5-year pause. I don't even think we need to start with 5. I would say just do a 3-year one to start. Do 3 years
total
pause on migration, right? So that's step one. So then you need a policy on
what would that achieve, though?
Well, straight away you're going to see housing prices start to go down. You're going to release the pressure on them. Rents are going to go down. But what else would that achieve? I mean, a complete collapse of the tertiary sector overnight, right?
Well, that wouldn't be a bad thing.
Well, exactly. And this is the thing this is what I don't understand about the Liberals' attitude on this. Is they're all whispering, saying, "Oh, well, we can't do anything about the international students because the unis will go bankrupt." Well, what have they done for you lately?
Exactly.
These academics are principally responsible for attacking you, for creating the ideology that attacks you, for putting it into our schools, for putting it into our public service. It's a good thing to do it. I mean, you're going to need a policy, and I don't know how much it would cost. I was actually looking at it for one of the independent candidates the other day. I said, you're looking at somewhere between $100 and $150 billion bailout for key research sectors. But it could mean,
why would you have to bail them out?
Well, because there's going to be shortfalls in things we actually care about, absolutely. Right. Particularly in the STEM sector. Right. You know, Australia does amazing work on research in, you know, quantum computing. So there's a lot of stuff where you wouldn't want to lose. And plus, a lot of that has previously been funded by the US government. And the US have now pulled completely out of our grant programs. Although I saw something the other day from ANU that said they're putting out these surveys now where you have to say that, you know, you don't indulge in all this like woke ideology so you can still get the US dollars.
Is that right?
Yeah. So
USAID is funding a lot of Australian
It did. It funded a lot of research. It funded a lot of good research. But I think, you know, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on universities. It is going to be fantastic to see places like UTS have their journalism school shut down or something like that. Like, you know,
well, that's a bit close to home. My son is a graduate of that degree.
Well, he's already out,
So he's safely graduated.
So, you know, there'll be consequences like that. But then the consequences keep going further downstream. You need a massive rethink around industrial relations because... You know, the thing that the left always throws back in your face in immigration is they say, well, who's going to, you know, wipe your nan's ass at the aged care home, right? Yeah. They throw that out there. Do you know what's going to happen if you cut immigration? What's going to happen to those aged care workers? They're going to be living in McMansions. You know, you look at the Australian tradie in high-vis going to and from work every day in the, you know, $100,000 Ford Raptor. Australia's the only place in the world that has that, where becoming a tradesperson is not only makes you prosperous, but it actually has prestige attached to it. That only exists in Australia. And why? Because we protected those jobs from immigration for decades. So if you have zero immigration and there are jobs out there that there aren't enough people to do, which was what we had in the trade sector in the 80s and 90s, they're going to have to pay them more. And that means that the little Nepalese ladies who, you know, clean my house or, you know, the ones, you know, cleaning up vomit in aged care homes, they're going to have their wages double within a couple of years. You're going to see massive growth. If you can't just keep bringing in people to do those jobs for free, the prosperity of the people doing those jobs will go up and the prestige attached to them will go up. If your kid said to you now, I want to become a contract cleaner, you'd say, oh, really? But in 5 years after a full pause on the unsustainable immigration, and they said, I want to become a contract cleaner, you go, well, you pay off my mortgage, right?
Yeah, this goes back to what you were saying before, how politicians are these days driven to saying one thing to one demographic and saying another thing to another. Like they'll go to an ethnic electorate and say, you know, we're going to bring in hundreds of thousands more Indians or more Muslims or whatever. And then they'll go to a working class Australian suburb and say, we're driving up wages for tradies. In fact, they're not. I mean, the tradies, well, in some ways they are because tradies get a lot of money out of infrastructure projects these days, and that's why you can't build houses. Is that right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, there's a string of reasons why they can't build houses. I mean, there's also the question, like, fundamental to that is should they? Like, is the correct thing to do to bring in, I mean, last month we brought in 200,000 international students. We're on track for another 1 million migrants this year, despite their, you know, protests otherwise. Do we want to live in a country where the population just goes up by 1 million every year and we build a new giant cube farm to stick them all in? These places are hideously ugly and have, you know, they might have nice infrastructure, but they don't have much else going for them.
They're not communities.
No, exactly. Yeah. So do we want our country to look like that or the kind of promise that it was in the 1990s? I mean, and that's why, you know, a lot of right-wing politics is derided as being reactionary, but it really just depends on when you want to go back to, you know. I mean, I always joke with Albanese and Dutton that they're reactionary as well. They just want to go back to 2004 when they were still relevant. That's when they want to take our country back to. They want to be going to the winter ball and having no one complain about them using the private plane. Like they want to be sitting down for, you know, interviews with journalists at the Australian and the Fin Review. They don't want to be going on podcasts. It's like having to appeal to normal people and caring what's said on Twitter.
Just one sec. Are you picking that up, that truck?
That's all right.
We can get it out.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. I just want to talk about housing because I did a deep dive into housing for the Australian probably about 10 years ago now, and I don't think the situation has changed. No. The fundamental principle in the housing, as far as housing policy goes, is that you can divide the country up into almost equal thirds. There are people who have paid off their house, people who are paying off their house, and people who are renting. And they're almost like identically sized, 33% of the population. Now, if you want to win government, it's in your interests to keep the majority of those happy. How do you do that? You keep property prices up, so you keep 2/3 the people who own their house and are paying off their house. They know their value is driving up, and the other third, who are young Australians renting, they can shove it.
They can sit and spin. That's their exact attitude. I mean, one thing they're really lucky about, and that they've been lucky with economically prior to... I mean, people forget that the housing crisis began in 2017. In 2017, Gladys Berejiklian became Premier in New South Wales. It was in her first press conference. She stood up in her first press conference and said, New South Wales is in a housing crisis. I'm going to address it by building, I think it was 64,000 homes, which she actually did, interestingly. So it starts all the way back then. But what was happening, which was, because we have such high wages, you have people, or we did at the time, we had people renting who were coming to the conclusion that, you know what, I'm never going to be able to afford a house. So then they stop saving and they start spending, which then increases the size of the rest of the economy. So you have this kind of like, and it's false, false prosperity, where you look at the balance sheet and you think, oh, well, people are going on holidays and they're buying cars and they're, buying PlayStations or whatever. And you think the economy is doing really well. But then look at those people's savings accounts. They've stopped saving because the idea of owning a home is ludicrous to them. So that's a real problem for us now, because how do you then go back to that cohort of people?
That's almost an irreversible problem.
I think it is. I really do think it is irreversible. And there's two ways through it. I mean, one, do you wait for a generation to die off and fix the economic conditions at the time of their deaths to force sales of houses? I mean, that would be very hard to do. I mean, and no one wants to touch inheritance taxes because they're just frankly immoral. So, how do you then get people into the market? Or do you decide that, well, that's not critical to Australia's future prosperity? Right now, I think what's kind of holding us back a little bit is this attitude that, well, you have to own a house. A house is the secret to your future wealth and prosperity for young people in Australia. But what if it wasn't? What if there are alternatives? What if we were to look at things like, more or better conditions for welfare when you're later in life, lower taxes on investments. I mean, they've cracked down on things like, what you can really do with your super insofar as contributing to it. I mean, the days of, like, my parents have retired in the last 5 years, but they spent the last decade of their working lives under more favourable super regulations, just ploughing money in there. You get a bonus at work, the money goes into your super, right? You can't really do that anymore. So is that something we look at? I mean, Australia is unique in that we have this super system. Like, it's not perfect. Well,
it goes back to Menzies. Menzies defined the house as central to your life.
Yeah. But is it always going to be?
Well, it's not going to be. And, just because it's always been that way since the 60s doesn't mean it always has to be. There are alternatives. But, there are alternatives, but it's hard to imagine any better than having a house which you are able to buy with your first job and in which you get married and raise a family and later on retire happily it's not a bad plan for life.
No, it's not.
And politicians...
But it's just so far away from people. It's just so far away from ordinary people now. And... then as you get older, you start to look at your retirement savings and think, I'm fucked. Like, what am I going to do? I'm going to have to, people are now thinking, I am going to have to live on...
just getting back to the forthcoming election, what do you think they're going to spring on us after the election? Because Australian federal elections these days are generally, they're kind of defined by telling us what we want to hear, as little as possible, and then after the election they spring us with some sort of idea that they've obviously been sitting on for a long time.
Well, it depends who wins. If Albo were to win, and I think it's 50-50, I don't think you could call who wins. I think if Albo wins, we're going to see some variation of a carbon tax. We're going to see that pop back up, and the main reason for that is that government revenues are so bad. We're out of revenue options. I mean, unless you get really exotic. I mean, let's say do inheritance taxes or something.
Well, I've heard that's quite possible.
But I would think some kind of minerals resources tax, whether it's about carbon or whether it's about resource exports themselves. I mean, there's good ways to do resources taxes.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Do you think they're adequate enough at the moment?
Oh, absolutely not. But I mean, I think what Labor's thinking will not be some kind of tax regime that's sustainable. And so like Norway's, for example, where Norway set up this decades long-term sustainable taxation regime on their minerals export, which they basically run their entire country and a luxurious welfare system with. Yeah. Labor's not going to do that. Labor are going to think, well, let's just get as much money as possible and send these guys broke because it helps get us to get to net zero.
Right.
So I think that'll be what the kind of stuff that they'll do. I think the big risk with the Liberals, if they win, and it's ludicrous to think they're going to do all this Trump stuff. I don't think they're really going to do it. But I think we could end up sending troops overseas. And my grave concern is that, people aren't reading the fine print of this content that's coming out with the coalition of the willing on Ukraine. I mean, Dutton said in a press conference yesterday, when asked about the timeframes around Starmer's coalition, how long would we potentially be supporting Ukraine for? And he said, well, of course, after the war. So we're going to keep supporting them after the war's over? What are you buying us into? And I can't see a single scenario for peace in Ukraine that will not require some peacekeeping element. Because whether it's in the Donetsk and Donbass region or in Crimea and Sevastopol, you have these regions which Russia have taken, which have ethnic Russian or cultural Russians and Russian speakers inside them, which were flashpoints for militant activity between 2014 and 2022. So no matter what happens, whether they remain in Russian hands or if they're given back to Ukraine or if there's some kind of middle ground, you are going to need third-party boots on the ground to make sure that the militants don't start another war. And it sounds to me from Dutton's rhetoric, he intends that to be us. And that is...
What is it in Dutton's character that makes him reach that conclusion?
I think, what I think a big part of it amongst Liberal politicians is, if you ever spend much time with Liberal MPs, there is just this reverence for the political culture of John Howard. And I think every one of them lives in this fantasy world that could be them, that they want to be faced with the same challenges. They want to rise to the occasions that Howard rose to. And so you get this, when you look at something like Ukraine, I think if you put that, Howard peak of the global war on terror hat on, they see it as this opportunity to be Howard-esque. And think about Howard in 1999. I mean, Howard sends in peacekeepers to East Timor, right? And he was lauded for it. I mean,
and that was good.
And that was a good thing to do, right? But also, East Timor is next door. You could swim there, and it was a place that for 30 years. I mean, Australia.
Well, they killed Australians.
They had killed Australians. It was at one point a pipeline for communists coming into our country. At another point, we were doing bad things over there and supporting overt war crimes. I mean, we had a history there. We had things to make right for. We had a country that we could create and become friends with, which we'd eventually fail to do. Yeah. But there's a heap of reasons, whether on the left or the right, you could make the case for sending peacekeepers to East Timor. The case for Australian peacekeepers in Ukraine is very, very flimsy. I mean, unless you go back to the death toll of MH117 or something.
But you're right, because the rhetoric they're using is as if it was East Timor. As if it was in our neighbourhood. Yeah. We're fighting for principles, but it's on the other side of the world, and most of us didn't even know where Ukraine was 3 years ago.
I mean, I did, but look, I've been over there. I've got friends over there. I speak to people who lobby on Ukraine's behalf with foreign governments all the time, who are the guys you see on TV demanding more bushmasters. And I have a lot of sympathy for their cause. But, you know, where it's landed now, I said this on a podcast I was on the other day, that, you know, when Russia failed to establish air superiority over northeastern Ukraine in the first 48 hours, that war became the First World War. And it's trench warfare. It's a meat grinder. It is killing tens of thousands of people a week. And, you know, we have this is not an argument to be had. We know this because we've had historians ventilated about the First World War over and over again. The moral thing to do was stop the conflict and to achieve peace.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
There was, you know, you had...
It's funny you should say that, because at the start of World War I, everyone just thought, oh, this is just going to be...
It's going to be quick.
Yeah, this will be over in a few weeks.
Yeah.
And Australia lost a generation of its finest men ever.
Yeah.
I mean, the best men, some of the best men in Australian history, they were our great generation.
And
they all volunteered to go and fight on the other side of the world.
For a war they knew nothing about.
Yep, and a lot of them died. Imagine what Australia would have been like had they not gone over there and died. Our country would have been dramatically different, I'd argue. I'll give you one last question, John. What will be the state of free speech after this election?
Bad. It's already bad. I mean, you know, depending on who wins, I mean, is there a chance that they kind of crab walk away from some of this stuff? Yeah, maybe. If there's certainly a big enough reaction against it and like votes going to the Libertarians and others, maybe. But they just seem so wedded to it in a way that's frankly terrifying, like absolutely terrifying, especially coming off the back of COVID. The stuff they've done, the hate speech laws in New South Wales, the hate speech laws in Canberra, I mean, absolutely retrograde. They, you know, were later found out to be based on a furphy, and there's zero apology for it.
Yeah, I mean, and no prospect of them being repealed.
Well, I mean, I think I'm not confident of them being repealed soon, but I'm very confident that at least the inquiry they got up in New South Wales, it's going to be just a shit show for Labor, because what this really comes down to. I mean, forget about, you know, lobbying from the Israel lobby, whatever. In terms of how the caravan thing came about, I mean, the New South Wales police...
So this is, just to be clear, this is the caravan that was found with explosives in it and supposedly intended for a synagogue.
Yeah.
Go on.
So the question is going to be, who knew what when? Now, the idea that the New South Wales police would not have briefed their bosses on, hey, hold your horses, like this might not be what you think it is. I believe 100% that's what the AFP did federally, because the AFP took a certain glee in coming out and doing the press conference and saying that all this had happened. And I think that might have been setting them up to a certain extent. I don't think, you know...
So Chris Minns knew
I think they knew. And I also think, I mean, I was looking at the legislation when it got tabled. I think 100% they had that already written. Yeah. And that was sitting on the shelf, and they were looking for an excuse. And so I think when this excuse came up, you know, they haven't wanted to deviate from their plan in the face of emerging information. And I think they've just thought that with the cover, because so many of them worked as staffers 15 years ago, right? A lot of these guys have no concept of how much the world's changed. So like, and actually there were actually things like this that did happen under the Carr administration. There was a famous case of a school shooting, a threat of a school shooting that was leaked, and Bob Carr did a big press conference on it and said how bad it was, and then said we were going to change a bunch of laws to make this not happen, and then it turned out it never happened. And it was basically, the whole thing was confected based on like a little scrap of information from the police. We've had this stuff happen before. And we had inquiries into that case years ago. This is back in 2006, 2005, 2006. But this time there's going to be an inquiry, and there's no media that has your back. See, back then, the Daily Telegraph, who splashed that story about the alleged school shooter, well, they just back in Carr the next day. And that's what everyone reads. Today, everyone is going to be reading the results of this inquiry online. All their friends in the media who back these laws, no one's reading that. So it's not going to matter that you get stories up in the Australian. It's not going to matter that the Sky News hosts back you or that the Daily Telegraph backs you, because it's going to be the social media campaign. And I don't think they're ready for that.
What was driving them? If you say that legislation was already on the shelf, what's their motivation? Why do they want us?
I mean, yeah, I mean that brings you back to the question about, you know, the Israel and Jewish lobby in Australia and whether or not, and the extent to which they are incredibly powerful, which is a vexed issue to talk about. I mean, even just saying the sentence, the Israel lobby is very powerful in Australia. Well, I mean, you could probably go to prison for 7 years for saying that.
I was just about to say, we're discussing the laws that just made that illegal.
So, I mean, I hang around with a lot of guys who have some pretty eyebrow-raising views on this stuff. But, I mean, my view of it, from having worked in there and having been lobbied by whether it's the Australian Jewish Association or the Board of Deputies or whatever, you know, Australia is a very unusual country in that some of the smartest people go into public affairs and lobbying. You don't get it in the United States, right? Like, I had a client a while ago who's a really big Israeli-born Jewish property developer from Jersey, and he'd come out to Australia. And I took him to a function, I think it was a Jewish Board of Deputies function, and he was looking around meeting these guys. And he said, you know, back home, where he was from, good Jewish family sends their kid to Harvard, graduates and says, Mum, Dad, I want to move to DC and lobby for APAC. Like, he'd be written out of the inheritance for that. You know, they say, no, like you're going to Goldman or you're going somewhere where you're going to make money. Like, worst case scenario, you're going to go to Hollywood. You're not going to work for a lobbyist? Like, what? Whereas here in Australia, that's considered really prestigious. So if you send your kid to ANU and they do international relations and public affairs and they come out and they get a job lobbying the federal government, that's considered a prestigious job. Competition for those jobs is really high. The guys who work there are way more talented than the guys who work for APAC in the United States. So that when you look at the results they get, and it's not just, I mean, I would say the Israel lobby is maybe in the top 5 most powerful lobbies in Australia. But there's still 4 others. They're just not in conflict, so you don't notice it.
Yeah.
But the reason for that is there's no conspiracy there. It's just because they're really good at their jobs. And anyone can be good at their jobs. Until very recently, the whole time I worked in politics, the most powerful lobby group in the country was the Australian Pharmacy Guild, right? Now, ask yourself, what is it about pharmacies that makes them so powerful? And the answer is nothing. They just had really good lobbyists working for them for 20 years. And so the Pharmacy Guild gets everything they want. I mean, the most powerful lobby group in New South Wales is arguably, apart from like the football codes and stuff, it's arguably the NRMA. Now, why are issues around roads and traffic fines and petrol prices, they're not naturally as important? They've just got a really good guy out front lobbying the government, doing media on it. You can do that in Australia. There's very few places in the world you can. We have that culture where, you know, you can just run a really good lobbying campaign and get what you want. And so I think, as we talked before about like why are things so bad, I mean, an element of that is like the incompetence of our political leadership. So when you have an environment where the competency of your political leadership is trending down and the competency of the people in lobbying outfits is trending up, you know, they're just easy marks. They're rubes.
Combine that with the fact that the both both major parties are preoccupied with only 21 seats.
Yeah, right. So suddenly you've just got this perfect storm.
Where does that leave the punters,